Empezamos con el que justamente acabamos de anunciar, que es Robert Lewis-Lettington, it's correct, no? Chief of Legislation Unit in Uni Habitat. So you want some remarks about this field?
A few remarks about myself. We go straight in. Let me. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so just to run through, I won't repeat what I said before about how I see governance as central to many of the equations, but looking at the question of inclusion and transparency in smart cities, starting off with the basic proposition that a smart city is not just a set of technical questions. I think we began to hear this a little bit yesterday. It's a policy proposition, which means it has some objectives implicit to it. You are trying to achieve something by saying, I am a smart city. Now, those need to be defined. As we all know in governance terms, if you don't make your government explain what its objectives are and what will it mean to have realized them, then you can't hold your government to account. You cannot say, I have done this or I have not. Sure, there may be spin-offs and you may want some flexibility, but you want a core proposition that you are aiming to achieve. So what is in the list and what isn't is a central question. It's not up to me as a lawyer to say to the technical people, this is what you should do, but it is up to me to say to them, please explain. Taking as a starting point a standard definition of smart cities, this is one that's used quite commonly by U4SSC, ITU, other organizations. It doesn't necessarily matter whether this is the same one that you use in your city and country, but I want to try and break apart, well, what does this mean as a policy objective? What does this say you should be trying to do? Because it's not just a stock phrase. So if you break it apart to start with, there are two core elements. I would argue that the blue section at the top is primarily a set of technical questions. What is the effective integration, physical, digital, human systems? How do you do that? What are the mechanisms? The second half is much more socio-political. You're talking about delivering, you're talking about sustainability, prosperity, inclusiveness, future citizens. These are all social and political concepts, and they all involve particular standards and objectives. So going through, looking at that social and political side, okay, I admit everybody says in my office that lawyers can make anything complicated, and I admit I may be making this complicated, but it is what somebody wrote in the phrase, and I'm just taking the words as written. So to deliver sustainability, prosperity, inclusiveness, future citizens, as I say. I'm just going to pick on a few of these and start exploring, well, what might they be? Inclusiveness. So when we're discussing that within Habitat, which is quite often, it's fairly close to our fundamental mandate. So we're looking at a baseline. If you don't know what is the presence, particularly of marginalized groups, if you don't know who is there in the first place, in what numbers and what proportions and what situations, then you don't have any idea of where you're going. So you need a fairly good baseline. If you're looking at a project, in your implementation, frequently, we've struggled with the fact that a lot of our projects say, well, I'm going to do X. I'm going to build a new transport corridor. I'm going to build a new neighborhood of the city. And then afterwards, we look at, well, let's see how it impacts different people. Realistically, you need to start earlier on saying, well, from my baseline, I know I have these groups who have these needs. What are the kinds of interventions that can be done to advance their basic interests and rights, secure their prosperity, increase their welfare? You can design that into projects. And then moving through, as you have implemented, well, what is the outcome? Did it work? If you don't have elements in all of these three, then how are you going to achieve inclusiveness? How are you going to measure it? How are you even going to be aware of it? Every city will have different groups. In all cities, I would argue that those I would include within the bracket of relative poverty are a factor. So anybody who is somewhere below about half of the median income for your country is going to be a concern, and how do they get affected? But also there will be other groups. It could be women, it could be the elderly, it could be indigenous populations. It all will vary depending upon where you are. And even within a city, what are the dominant factors within the neighborhoods that you're operating in? And all of this comes through in technology, because obviously technology is highly pervasive and highly mobile. It doesn't tend to be concentrated in one neighborhood. It tends to spread across an entire city and have the whole population. So future, it might seem simple. It's what isn't now and it's what will come. Okay, but that has real implications. Very few of the impacts that any of our projects are going to do are going to be immediate. They all have some kind of time sense to them. You're looking at, well, how are you factoring that in? How are you engaging with citizens around it? Short, medium, long term, and then the disaggregation by priorities. What happens across your different intended impacts, across the different timeframes, and how will you manage that? Also, in terms of timeframe, the question of duty bearers coming from human rights language, but the idea, who is responsible for the things that you're proposing will happen in future? Who has to be held to account for that? Because it's quite easy just to say, well, we will aim at this happening and then leave it floating. But if you don't follow through on saying there is a given office or a given institution that must make this happen, or must explain why and mitigate if it doesn't happen, because we admit not everything works, then you don't have a sense of your timeframes. And finally, the element of progressive realization frequently comes from things like the right to health and the right to a clean environment. But again, the idea that not everything will happen immediately, but that doesn't mean we failed. We can look at a progression towards where we want to get, and we can look at phasing and steps of how we will reach there. For citizens, okay, a bit more complicated. I mean, you can argue a lot around who are citizens. I would probably prefer residents in a city context, because trying to get into too many them and us groups in most big cities is a very complicated proposition. But leaving the identity side of citizens aside, still, if something is going to be for citizens, it has to be effective. How do you judge it? It's got to be relevant, it's got to be cost effective. With big technology projects, this is frequently a major challenge. There are an awful lot of really good ideas. My children will tell you I come up with about 10 a day, and most of them are rubbish. But occasionally, some of them are good, and you've got to be able to assess it against something and push it forward. Does it give what citizens want? The transparency of things, so we're looking at impartiality, we're looking at the distribution of cost benefits across society. Who wins, who loses from different things? How are the decision-making structures constructed? And then the accountability. What is the proportionality of my intervention? What I mean by that is looking at the potential risks and costs to us as a society. What is the gain, and is that a reasonable objective for us to be involved with? This may come into, for example, data privacy rights in facial recognition and invasion of privacy versus the benefits in security. We have a big program in Habitat on urban safety, and weighing up those pros and cons of different projects is a major concern. How the decision-making processes will be constructed? Who gets to decide, and can citizens see who gets to decide? Because as soon as a decision is behind closed doors or according to criteria that we don't know, experience tends to suggest that we have some problems. But if you make the decision maker clear out in the open, and you say the criteria against which they have to decide, citizens can then make a decision. I think that's okay, I think it's not. You can then look through. They can also monitor the implementation, saying, well, you told us you were going to do this, and this was the goal. Has it happened? So these kinds of things create a stronger and a more open governance framework. So overall, we're looking at how power is distributed and shared is the heart of governance. I know there are very many definitions of governance, but one of the things I want to try and make clear is that it's much more about how decisions get made and how we judge them and how we measure them and how we hold people accountable to them. When you move into the implementation, you're much more dealing with management and the implementation of an agreed goal. Having a clear sense of how those two are distinct can be quite important for constructing your system, because otherwise you can lose governance in what is really management. You can bury those core principles of rights and inclusion. Now, just to look there at finally in closing, there are a few different ways, this came out of ITU work in the focus group on data processing and management, that there are some different ways that you can cut how you construct your governance framework, where the sources come from, what are the areas of decisions. Strategic operational is a big one, and I'll show that in a final slide. Heterogeneity, recognizing that the way technology functions now means that we have a far more diverse context than we've ever had. Multiple data sources, multiple stakeholders, multiple actors, multiple purposes. At a global level, these are not all people under your immediate regulation and control. That has to be factored in. And then fluidity. Everything is evolving so fast that you've got a lot of moving targets. How do you construct a system that will cope with that? So just to look, this is just in closing, one way you can cut your governance system is through these elements. At a high level, strategic decision-making and oversight. You're then coming down to a slightly lower level of principles, safeguards, and standards, a bit lower in the sense of a bit more applied. And then you come into the management level where you're implementing what you've decided at the higher levels. If you work through that and you have a clear decision of what you're doing at each layer, you'll have an easier way of getting a grip on things. Similarly, the sources of where you're getting what you need to decide. At an international level, there are hard elements, things that you have to do and you really don't have a whole lot of choice through. In Europe, GDPR is just a reality. You have to deal with that, you have to navigate it. But there are also trade agreements that have a number of binding standards, and there's a lot of soft elements as well. There are guidelines, ITU recommendations, all sorts of different elements. This hard and soft dichotomy exists at every level, international, national, and local. Some things you have to do, some things that influence what you do, and you need to identify what are the inputs in each one and make a conscious decision of which ones am I going to pursue, which ones advance my interest, and how do they fit together. That way you can then construct a governance framework that suits what you need as a city. My very final point, I mean, we can't leave this to just come out as a random set of actions and a random set of actors. I think you need to do it as an integrated, conscious effort and a coherent framework. And I think for many, many cities, probably 3/4 of the city, we reckon in Habitat about 4,500 cities in the world over 100,000 population. If we take of those 4,500 cities, there's probably not more than 500 that have the governance capacity to do all of this on their own, work it all through, work out the details. There needs to be some approach of support and consistent information, and maybe the establishment, not necessarily of binding frameworks, but of outline frameworks that cities can pick up and say, okay, here's the set of questions I need to think about. Here are some of my options for answers. I think particularly as the field becomes more diverse, these kinds of frameworks and cooperation will become more important. And that's it. Thank you very much.